Hey everyone, Kate here. Before we get to the episode, I have a favor to ask. I'm trying to get a better sense of how you listen to the show, what you love about it, and what you'd like to hear more or less of. Please go to draftingthepast.com/survey to take a quick listener survey. A huge thanks to everyone who has already responded. Your answers are already making a difference in how I think about the show. If you haven't yet, take a minute to let me know what you think at draftingthepast.com/survey. Okay, on to today's episode. Welcome back to Drafting the Past, a podcast about the craft of writing history. I'm Kate Carpenter, and in each episode of this show, I interview a historian about how they research and write. Today, I'm joined by Dr. John Garrison Marks, whose new book is Thy Will Be Done: George Washington's Legacy of Slavery and the Fight for American Memory. This is a fantastic book that takes a careful and often surprising look at how generations of Americans have remembered and forgotten George Washington's relationship to slavery and how they've used that memory to bolster their own arguments. I'm thrilled to have John on the show to talk more about it.
Thank you so much for having me.
John has a PhD in history and he works as a public historian. He's the Vice President of Research and Engagement at the American Association for State and Local History. So he is steeped in the role of public history across the country. He's the author of a previous book, Black Freedom in the Age of Slavery, and co-editor of an anthology. John has written essays and op-eds for outlets including Time and the Smithsonian Magazine. Recently, his expertise on the memory of Washington's relationship to slavery became particularly relevant when the National Park Service removed an exhibit about the history of slavery at the President's house in Philadelphia. And John was ready to jump into the fray and offer vital historical context. The book came out last week, but we spoke a couple of months ago, and I asked John about the relationship between his work with public historians and how he thinks about writing history, as well as how he manages to write while having a busy day job and a young family. We're all going to get a lot out of this episode, I think. Here's my conversation with Dr. John Garrison Marks. Can you just start by describing the trajectory of your career as a writer?
A funny question, because I don't think of myself as having a career as a writer, but I guess in some sense I do. Writing has sort of always been something that I've been good at. I recognized pretty early on, like in middle school and high school, certainly as an undergrad, I realized that I was decently good at writing. And so I gravitated towards things that let me do that a lot. That's, probably a big part of the reason that I became a history major. And, I was decently good at that too. And so I went to graduate school, and that's where I feel like kind of honed my skill as a writer, because you do so much of it and, did more reading than I have at any other point in my life. Right. And so I figured out how to write like an academic in grad school. And I got decently good at it, good enough to get a PhD and good enough to finish my dissertation and turn it into a book. But I had never really done much writing beyond that. I had done the 5-paragraph essay. I had figured out how to write like an academic, but that was sort of it. And after I finished grad school, I didn't get an academic job. I started doing other stuff. And I decided for the first time in my life, I have time to read whatever I want. And so for probably a good almost 2 years after finishing grad school, I didn't pick up a history book. I didn't pick up a nonfiction book. I just read fiction for literally the first time in my life. And that, I think, just got me started thinking about different ways of writing a little bit more, and certainly got me exposed to a much wider variety of ways to tell stories and stuff like that. And then I got a job in public history working for the National Professional Association that serves history museums. And I started getting kind of exposed to all sorts of new stories and new trends and things that were happening. And I realized that I was in a pretty privileged position at a national association to kind of see those trends in a way that people at individual institutions might not have. And that's when I started thinking, I could write about this and maybe write for some kind of national outlet. And there would be something interesting to say here. And so that I started with the 250th, and with some other trends that I was seeing, just started sending pitches to places like the Washington Post or Time or Smithsonian Magazine, and some of them got accepted. And I was, then doing more reading of magazine pieces and essays and trying to figure out how I wanted mine to sound. And I think they've gotten better over time, but that became something that I wanted to do. And so now I'm sort of have some relationships with editors, and I'm able to write some of these shorter pieces that I think are really interesting. There's all sorts of interesting stuff happening in public history. And then through my work on the 250th and my connection with people at museums and historic sites, I started thinking about my current book, and that it just kind of worked its way into my brain and I couldn't get rid of it. But I realized, I'm not on the tenure track. I don't need to write a book for tenure. I don't need to write a book for other academics. I can write this book however I want. And had kind of decided that if I was going to write another book, I was going to try to write a book that I thought people might actually read, not just my academic colleagues and my kind of subfield. So I started thinking about what that would look like, and ultimately wasn't able to shake the idea, somehow convince the folks at the Kluge Center at the Library of Congress that this was an idea worth supporting. And I spent a year there doing the research and have sort of been with it ever since. And we'll see where things go from here.
Fantastic. Well, let me ask you about the nuts and bolts of your writing process. So when and where do you like to work?
Well, when and where I like to work is a very different question from when and where I actually do work. I wrote this book mostly between the hours of 4:30 a.m. and 7 a.m. I have a day job. I have a job that does not involve writing books. Sometimes some of my essays can kind of split the difference a little bit, and I can work on them a little during work hours. But this book was totally outside what I do for my day job. So that's a 9 to 5. And I have 2 kids who are today 7 and 4. When I first started writing this book, were 5 and 2, mostly 6 and 3 for the duration of it. And so I had to find time in my day that I could spend some time writing it. And that time was first thing in the morning before my kids got up. So every day was kind of a race. I would go down, my office is in a converted garage in the basement. So half the year it's freezing cold. But I would go down most of the time from, around 5 o'clock, and I would write until my youngest son got up, and he would come down and find me in the office, and that would kind of be it for the day. And so it was always just a question of like, how much can I get done in the 90 minutes, usually around 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours if I got really lucky. In the dead of winter when the sun comes up later, I could get a little more time, but that was it. And so I tried every day to set myself up at the end of my writing, at the end of my sort of writing block, to have a place that I could pick up when I'm half awake the next morning. I would brew a double espresso with my little Nespresso machine that a colleague at the Library of Congress gave me before she went back to the UK. Forever in debt to her. And I would always try to leave myself a kind of place that I could pick up relatively easily, that even before I'm awake, even before my brain's kind of fully working, okay, I know, I left off here yesterday, or I'm going to write about this little piece of evidence, or what have you. I always, I can't work on my laptop. I have a big screen in front of me that I can, put evidence or documents or PDFs to one side and put my writing to the other side. The one indulgence when I started writing this book is I bought myself a mechanical keyboard, and that makes me feel like a writer, and that counts for something, I think. Being able to kind of clickety clack away while I'm writing just always sounds very, very pleasant to me. But in terms of kind of the mechanics of what I do and how I did it, I wrote most of the book in Scrivener. And I'm sure tons of people, have talked about Scrivener on this podcast, but it was an essential tool for me. The part about it that I always talk about the most, or that I appreciate the most, is just how easy it is to move sections and stuff around in it. That made it really easy for me, for someone who never had these long blocks of writing time. I could come in and say, I know I have to write about this one document today, or I know I need to write this one section, and I didn't have to worry about finding it in a long document, scrolling around, or where it was going to fit in the piece. I could just go and knock out those 500 words or 1,000 words or less, often less. And I could just do that and know that it was going to be easy enough to kind of make that fit in later. And so the ability of Scrivener to do that was just so fantastic, and I loved it. I organized my research in DevonThink, and that was another one that I really appreciated. And I've talked about that a little bit elsewhere, but just the ability to tag stuff and, have my kind of organization for everything and have everything be in text files and PDFs and not some, inaccessible other proprietary format with some other program. So that was sort of my two big pieces, was working in research in Dev and Think and writing in Scrivener. And I waited as long as possible before moving it out of Scrivener. But I basically wrote the whole thing first thing in the morning and just tiny, tiny bits at a time, 500 words at a time, more or less, for a year or a year and a half. And then one day I looked up when I finished a chapter and was thinking about what the next thing I had to do was. And I realized, like, oh my God, I think I'm almost done with this book. Like, I think I only have a little bit. I think I only have to do this one thing left, and then I'll be done. And that helped kind of motivate to get to the finish line.
Sure. How do you know when you're ready to start writing? Where in the research process do you like to start?
Yeah, I probably should have started even earlier than I did. And I started earlier for this project than I have for previous projects. For me, it was sort of circumstantial this time around, where I had this year-long fellowship at the Library of Congress, and I knew I wanted to be able to at least start writing while I was there. And, it turned out the research was taking longer than I expected, as always. It kind of, the project grew while I was there. It ended up being something that is very different than the project I thought I was going to be doing when I got there. But I realized I needed to use that time to do at least some writing. And for me, and I also learned from other projects that how much you forget while you're doing research, no matter how many times, you tell yourself, ooh, I'm going to remember this bit of like what I wanted to do with these sources, or that I had these sources, you always forget. And so little by little, project by project, I'm getting better at acknowledging that reality. And so there were times where I was writing and maybe it felt like less pressure because I was doing writing, but I never thought that the words were actually going to be part of the book. I was just writing to summarize research that I had done before I moved on to another thing. So, for example, like when I wanted to see how all of these early biographies of George Washington talked about his relationship to slavery and talked about his last will and testament and his decision to free the people he enslaved in his last will and testament. There are dozens of biographies of Washington in the first couple years after he dies, and they're all called The Life of George Washington or The Life of General Washington. I have dozens of books with the exact same title. And so part of the reason I started writing about them was like, I have this straight in my mind now. And I know that 6 months from now or a year from now, this is going to look like a complete mess because all these books have the same title, and different editions talked about him in different ways. So immediately after he dies, talks about him and talks about slavery in a different way than 2 years later, than 5 years later, than 10 years later. And so that was, I think, the first piece of the book that I wrote was like, I just need to summarize what I found here. And it ended up being really useful because I had forgotten all of that by the time I felt like I was really writing the book and working in Scrivener. But I was just doing text files that I kept in my research database of here's what's happening here. And I think most of that just got, it was tens of thousands of words that just got deleted, never made it into the book. But it made it much easier when I actually was writing those sections to know what I wanted to write and to know how to slot those different pieces of evidence in and stuff like that. And then sometimes just because I think had taken the pressure off of writing because, I didn't feel like I was actually writing the capital B book, you would get to a point just by, kind of moving through it where you're like, oh, I actually have like some interesting things to say here. And I actually, and you go back and find it and be like, actually, like I was thinking about how to say that and I figured it out 6 months ago. The worst is when you forget that you've done that. And I actually would write almost the exact same sentence 6 months apart. That happened to me at least once where I was like, I got it. This is it. Like, this is a great sentence. And then I went back to my research notebook and was like, oh, I almost wrote that exact same sentence. That must be why I think it sounds so good. But yeah, so I started earlier than usual this project. And I think I'll continue to do that in future projects and start even earlier of just sort of writing notes to self, and having them get longer and longer and, just sort of be narrative description of what is in some of these sources, because I surprised myself with what that unlocked sometimes of, I thought I was just describing a document or a source, and actually it, ended up being being something that made it into the final book.
At some point, do you stop and outline so that at 4:30 in the morning, you know where you're going?
Yeah, I mean, for this project, I had a pretty good sense of how I wanted the structure to work. As I was going through the research, I realized that this was a story that was going to stretch across basically 250 years of American history. And so I sort of needed pieces that were going to slot into sort of big eras of American history. And I had all sorts of evidence and so I sort of started to figure out like, okay, what is the most interesting story I have to tell for this era? And they all kind of go backwards a little bit and go forwards a little bit, but the biggest part of the narrative, the biggest part of the story is sort of grounded in one particular era. And so I sort of knew that was going to be how I was going to do it fairly early on, just from looking at my evidence. But then I would start trying to outline a chapter and say, like, I think this is how it's going to work. And I would do that in Scrivener and, put headers and put sections and say, this is how it's going to work, and would write some notes of like this, and this goes here. And, describe this thing in this section. But I don't think any of my chapters actually worked out that way. You would write a long section and be like, no, this doesn't make any sense here. Like, I want to reference this at the beginning of the chapter. I don't want to have to wait till the end. And so I have to flip flop those things, and I have to do this differently. And so I always had an idea of like, okay, this is the little piece I need to work on today, and thought I knew where it was going to go. And then I would get to the end of a chapter, or I would, while writing, realize that like, oh, this isn't working because it's preventing me from talking about this other thing where I want to talk about it. And then I would sort of move things around as I was going. But I also, with this project, and this is not something I did with my dissertation or my first, my revisions on my first book, but I would finish a chapter and I would not go back and read it. I would just say, that chapter's done. I'd have a good enough sense from, revising along the way and moving things back and, around the chapter while writing it, that once I got to the point where I thought it was done, I just moved to the next chapter, because I knew that I'd be able to just endlessly edit and revise that one chapter. And I wanted this book to come out in 2026, right? I was doing all this work for the 250th at my day job at AASLH. I knew that this was going to be a good topic for 2026. And then mainly by the time I started writing, I had a contract that said this book was going to come out in 2026. And I had to hand in the manuscript by the beginning of 2025. And so I knew if I started going back and looking at the chapter I had just read or I had just written, I was never going to get out of it. And so I just kind of forged along, and it ended up being, so I did it because it was practical, not because it was some stroke of writerly brilliance in technique. But I think it actually really ended up working well, because I was able to get the whole thing and then figure out, okay, here's what I'm talking about, after I had written 110,000 words or something, and then realizing like, okay, this is what I want this chapter to be, and this is how they're gonna fit together, and this can get added here, and I can take out this thing there. And so there was definitely a sense of like, I knew the little part I was going to do that day, but I tried not to get lost in thinking about the whole big thing all at once, and just looking through a keyhole at the book ended up being really useful as a strategy.
Once you have the whole big thing, what does revision look like then? Like, from a practical standpoint, how do you approach that?
Thankfully, I had a great editor. I worked with Debbie Gershenowitz, who's since left UNC, but she did a great job with the book. I had some great colleagues who helped give me feedback, and I, had some really great peer reviewers who were very kind with their time, and so that was at different stages of revision. But I was really trying to read it and make sure that I kept thinking about like my dad and my brother-in-law while I was revising, and thinking like, okay, how do I write this in a way that is going to be interesting to them, not just interesting to my historian colleagues, and really focusing on who I wanted to read this book. And that, led to some changes in structure of, realizing, oh, I need to introduce what this is, this idea of, the second middle passage, the sale of enslaved people from the upper South to the lower South. I need to explain what's going on there, or I needed to introduce gradual emancipation laws or these other concepts more than I had, and trying to read and just get the prose where I wanted it. When I was writing my first draft, there was a lot of just like, no, I'm just describing. I'm just describing my evidence. I'm like building an argument. It was written as probably a serviceable academic book. And it wasn't until that second pass through, and sometimes you'd be writing and something would come to you and you'd be like, oh yeah, that's good. And then when you go back through it, you'd be like, I don't know who I think I am, but that, that ain't it. And then, take that part out. But that's when I started thinking about like, okay, how do I want this book to feel to people? How do I want it, want it to sound, and what is my voice, and how do I kind of work that into these chapters? And, I guess there's kind of a fake it till you make it element to all of this. I think that every writer probably recognizes to some degree of like, no, I want this to be like a trade work of history. I want it to be of interest to a general readership. And I've read a bunch of these books, and this is what those books sound like. And, how do I, write that in a way that feels true to me and feels like it's me writing it, but also is kind of being written for that audience and in that way. And that was, a big part of going back through my drafts and getting it to that point. But every time you finish a draft and you feel like, yes, I've gotten it. This is the book, you send it off to someone and then you get it back. And even if it just, that process took 2 weeks or a month for someone else to read it, having that bit of time, I wish I'd had more of it while writing, but having that bit of time to come back and say, okay, actually, like, this is pretty good. I really like this part. And then other things that, you're like, oh God, this was awful. I could do this. It's so obvious why this is bad. I'm going to fix that and do this differently. And I was very surprised, but very pleased that by the end of the project, when I was rereading the proof for the last time, I was actually thinking like, you know what? Like, I think I like this book. I think I like how it turned out, which when you've been with your own words and your own voice for that long is felt like a huge victory. So I hope other people enjoy it, but I'm just glad I got to the end and didn't feel like I hate this thing. I can't read it anymore. Just wanted to get it away and thought that all the revision had left it somewhere pretty good.
Fantastic. Well, I'm glad that you ended up there. I did note, though, that in the acknowledgments, you talk about struggling with anxiety and self-doubt while you were working on the book, which I think is something a lot of people struggle with when they write. So I was wondering if you have advice for how you kind of muddle through that, how you keep getting up at 4:30 in the morning when you are fighting that feeling.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know that I would trust a writer who says like, yes, I'm a great writer and I love it and it's great all the time. I think dealing with those doubts is just part of writing a book and part of the sort of ebb and flow of the writing journey. And this is where the sort of circumstances of my daily writing that I was forced into, I think really helped in some regard, because like I didn't have the luxury of spending, hours and hours thinking about like, is this the right way to do it? Is this what I want? And, I had an hour or an hour and a half to get some little section done, and just, I had a little whiteboard that said, do the work, written on it, i.e. like not post on Blue Sky about writing and actually sit down and write. But like only being able to do that little bit at a time kind of helped reduce how much I was thinking about like, oh God, are people going to like this thing? Is this thing any good? But certainly that comes in to it. There's just points there where I'm like, and I guess where I'm wondering, is this book any good? Does this make any sense at all? And part of it is that like I'm not in an academic department. I had this great cohort of people I was with when I was researching the book, but I had virtually nobody. I was alone in my basement, a lot of the time in the dark, writing the book. And you just start to wonder, like, you don't have people to talk to about it on a day-to-day basis and bounce ideas off of and whatever. And you start to wonder, like, am I actually working on something worthwhile here? But there's a quote I always come back to that I learned, or I heard for the first time in graduate school. The historian Caleb McDaniel was on my dissertation committee. He's since won a Pulitzer Prize, but I took a research methods class, cultural history methods class with him. And I remember seeing this quote on one of his early presentations to us that has sort of rattled around. And, I've paraphrased it in my mind ever since. And I had to go back and find the actual quote so that I could mention it here. So I found it for the first time in over a decade. So I'm glad to have the full thing and to know who wrote it. But it is from the author Annie Dillard. And the quote is, "There is neither a proportional relationship nor an inverse one between a writer's estimation of work in progress and its actual quality. The feeling that the work is magnificent and the feeling that it is abominable are both mosquitoes to be repelled, ignored, or killed, but not indulged." And I always just loved that. It was just it's such a good reminder. And I try to think about it all the time that the moments where you're like, I am a genius. This work is great. I am, writing some incredible stuff down here. It's probably not as good as you feel like it is in that moment. And the moments where you're like, this is trash. None of this makes sense. No one is going to want to read this are also not true. And something I like every time all of that self-doubt crept in is something that I just told myself over and over again of maybe this isn't going to be, hit the New York Times bestseller list, but it's probably good. And it's, it at least has that going for it, and trying to work from there.
To give us a closer introduction to John's work before we talk more about it, I asked him to read an excerpt from the first chapter of his new book. Here's Dr. John Garrison Marks reading from Thy Will Be Done, George Washington's Legacy of Slavery and the Fight for American Memory.
It can be tempting, given Washington's anti-slavery sentiments and notwithstanding his effort to recapture Ona Judge, to view him as enlightened beyond his era when it comes to slavery, or at least more aligned with his northern contemporaries than with his fellow Southerners. The most generous interpretation, favored by some scholars, historic sites, and Washington supporters, suggests Washington was an unfortunate product of the colonial slave society into which he was born. According to this view, Washington was thrust into a world where the enslavement of Black people was seen as natural, but as he grew older, encountered more egalitarian political philosophies, and witnessed firsthand the courage and humanity of Black people during the American Revolution, he overcame his prejudices and began to see the immorality of the slave system. Slowly, Washington grew to support an end to slavery. Such a story is, unfortunately, all too simple. The more complex reality is that even as Washington's views on slavery evolved, he often expressed a rather dim view of the abilities and character of the Black people he personally enslaved. Washington's direct involvement in slavery never ceased. Time and again, Washington acted as a typical enslaver, right until the very end. Even after the American Revolution, Washington continued to act in ways that contradicted his professional desire to see slavery end. Well into the 1790s, while he privately questioned the morality of slavery, Washington disparaged the work ethic of the people he enslaved. In a 1793 letter, for example, Washington wrote that when an overlooker's back is turned, most enslaved people will slight their work, or worse, not work at all. Washington's views of the capabilities of the people he enslaved often surfaced in his letters back to Mount Vernon during his time as president. While in Philadelphia, Washington remained deeply involved in managing his estate, receiving regular updates from Mount Vernon. In 1793, William Pierce took over day-to-day management of Mount Vernon, and the letters he received from Washington, though they mostly referred to the minutiae of plantation management, such as crop rotations, seed quantities, and weather, reveal Washington's ongoing direct involvement in enslaving people, as well as how his view of individual enslaved people had not evolved alongside his broader ideas of the institution of slavery.
Okay, so I was really torn while I was trying to decide what to have you talk about, in part because chapter 1 is really not the point of the book, right? That this is the one chapter where you are kind of establishing the background for the reader, making sure we're all on the same page. And then in each subsequent chapter, you're exploring the argument that different people in different times used Washington's memory, often in very contradictory ways, to sort of bolster their position. But I picked this passage in part because the more I thought about it, the more it felt like this chapter was the hardest to write, at least in my imagination, because, you know, in all the other ones, you get to show how people did different things and kind of make these strong points. But here you're you're trying, I don't want to say you're trying to be objective because that's a challenging thing to say as a historian, but like you really are kind of trying to just get down to like what we can all know about Washington and slavery. Like, here's what we know from the primary sources. And you're trying to do that kind of even-handedly. But of course, like I said, no objectivity, right? There's always interpretation. So how did you approach this chapter with all of that in mind?
I didn't really want to write this chapter, and it wasn't the first one that I wrote. And then I realized that if I started with just how people have kind of cherry-picked from Washington's record and used his involvement with slavery in various ways and how they've cited it across, generations, centuries of American history, none of it would make sense if the reader didn't have some grounding in what these people were talking about. There's so often, in the 19th century, 20th century, today, people are referring to specific Washington quotes that have become kind of tried and true ways to reference certain parts of his record. His 1786 quote that no one wishes more sincerely than I do to see an end to slavery, paraphrasing a little bit there, but that I needed to cover this ground for the reader if all of these references were going to make sense. The fact that he emancipated these people in his will, what that meant, how many people he enslaved, all of that. And so this chapter, much more than the other chapters, was a work of synthesis. There is a lot that's been written on the subject of George Washington's involvement in slavery. Especially Mount Vernon historian Mary Thompson. She had a book that came out a few years ago that is really comprehensive of, sort of the experience of enslaved people at Mount Vernon, where they lived, worked, how many people in each place, all of those things. And so in some ways, it was the easiest chapter to write because I wasn't building an argument from scratch in the same way. I still don't really think of myself as a historian of Washington. This is very much a cultural history where George Washington is sort of a player in it, but it's about other people. It's not about him. But also in the times that I've started talking about this book already, this is the stuff that people want to talk about. And that is fascinating in its own right. But I really tried to take the view of like, if I was coming to this for the first time, which in a lot of ways I was, right? I had the sort of surface level knowledge that most people have about George Washington and his involvement with slavery. And then realized I needed to sort of build this context setting chapter. And so, there's all this work that's been happening on this subject for decades, right? It was a work of synthesis, of realizing, different people are coming at this in different ways. Which ways do I find most convincing? Some of the most recent research that's drawing on his farm reports, some of these letters back and forth to Mount Vernon that really make clear, no matter all of the great things he's saying about his desire to see slavery end, he's still so involved in enslaving people and denigrating enslaved people and all of that. And, I was able to sort of find a path through to talk about there is some change and there's some evolution, but it's not this easy story of, he started one way and he ends in another way. And it ends with this final big moment of him freeing the people he enslaved. It would be great if that's what the record supported because it would be a much easier story to tell, but that's just not what it was. And so I think the real challenge of this chapter, and it's something that still keeps me up at night, is I set up, I hope in the introduction, this kind of interesting story of, here's what happens across American history. And then the first chapter is this like somewhat, to me at this point, feels somewhat boring, right? Like it's not the cool, interesting stuff that I feel like I get to talk about in the rest of the book. It's this other stuff about like, here is George Washington's history with slavery. It's of a different type. My worry in writing it was like, I can't start people off with 20,000 words, 25,000 words about George Washington and slavery. Like they're never going to make it to chapter 2 if I write it this way. And so part of the revision process for this chapter was like, I know I want to include all of this context and all of this detail and all of these little examples and quotes. And I have all of my like precious little gems that I've mined and polished and, made ready for people to look at. But like, how much of that is really necessary? Like how much, where do I have 4 quotes where 1 quote would be fine? And I can just kind of describe the trend with the other ones. And, where can I collapse things? And where am I able to get rid of some, really fine-grained distinction that I'm drawing in a way that is still truthful to the record and, helps people understand it better and more accurately and more clearly, but I can get through a little bit quicker. And so it felt very necessary, and it is necessary for understanding the ways people are talking about Washington in the rest of the book and all these examples that I'm citing. But I also didn't want the book to feel like I was, making the reader take their medicine before they got to the fun stuff. And so I tried to tell it in a way that was kind of flowed narratively, and just in the revision was always asking myself, like, is there an easier way to tell this story? Is there a smoother way to tell this story? Do I need all of these details? And I don't know, hopefully readers feel like they come away with more than they had going in, but also feel like they are looking forward to reading chapter 2, not like they just escape their worst nightmare of a history lesson after getting done with it.
I didn't feel that way. I don't think
Good.
other readers will feel that way. I feel like if you took 10 different historians and said, I want you to write a book that covers all American history and talks about how people have used Washington's memory, you would have 10 very different books at the end of that. So if you can take me back a little to how you approached the book as you were imagining it, researching it, how did you settle on your structure for this book?
Yeah, it came to me in a dream, I guess. It's something that feels like it sort of just started to make sense as I was writing. But I originally set out to write a very different kind of book. I wanted to write a book that was all what I wrote my third chapter about, which is what happened to the people George Washington freed from slavery. That was the sort of driving question that got me into this project. And there is so much that has been written on what happens leading up to that point, but it is always the end of the story. And I wanted to know what happens if you make that the beginning of the story. Where does that take you? My first book was about the experiences of free Black people in Charleston, South Carolina, and Cartagena de Indias, Colombia. And so I had done this kind of research on my book and on first book and on other projects of, this kind of deep social history for, finding out about the experiences of free Black people. And so that's what I wanted to do at first. And then as I was researching that chapter and looking for those sources, I kept finding all of these other things, and I wasn't finding enough, that one big murder case you always hope you're going to find, that where, there's testimony explaining all these relationships and details. I never found that, but I did find all of these other references to Washington's emancipation of the people he enslaved. And, especially I was looking through newspapers to try to find references to it, and it kept bringing me to the Liberator. And so I kept seeing these incredible examples of abolitionists using Washington's decision to free the people he enslaved in their rhetoric. And so that flipped things for me. It was like, what is what is going on here? When did people learn that he had freed the people he enslaved? Did they care in 1799, 1800? Started to ask that question. And then I started to see it more and more in contemporary discourse, right? Certainly in the summer of 2020, as I was thinking about the book, there's lots and lots of emphasis. I would say more than we've ever seen, but as I show in the book, that's not really the case. But a re-emphasis on Washington's history with enslavement, and utterly no mention of the fact that he did free the people he enslaved in his last will and testament, something that Jefferson didn't do, Madison didn't do, Monroe, no one else. None of the other Virginia founders free the people they enslaved, or none of the other Virginia presidents anyway, free the people they enslaved. And so started wondering early on, like, why isn't that part of the story we tell about Washington now? It seems like that matters, like that is significant. And I felt encouraged that other people have found that incredibly significant, throughout American history at different points and times. And so I sort of knew where I wanted to start, and I knew where I wanted to end, right? That I had to talk about what was happening today, and I had to bring it all the way up to the present to make this work the way that I wanted to. And so it was sort of figuring out, how do I get from A to Z? And some of it was just, reading and, reading secondary sources about, like I knew that education and classroom debates was going to be part of this. because was coming up in the present, the way people were talking about Washington in the classroom in places like Florida. And so I started reading some of this literature on, the secondary literature on education controversies and curriculum controversies. And these pieces would just be a little, maybe a page or a paragraph or a sentence reference to the founders or reference to Washington. And I'd say, oh, that's interesting, and kind of go down a rabbit hole, figuring out what was there. And wasn't really thinking about structure that much at this point. But eventually I got to a point where I had to write a proposal to try to sell this book and get it published. And, started thinking about, okay, well, what are the best stories that I have here? And, I have all this stuff from the 1930s about education, but that stuff's, more complicated. Actually, the stuff from the 30s about the George Washington bicentennial is like the best story. And so that kind of fits there. And that can be my early 20th century piece. And then, the education controversies can be my kind of mid to late 20th century piece. And sort of knew where if I wanted to cover everything, I couldn't have huge gaps in time, because there would be no bridge from what just happened to what I was transitioning into. But I also knew that it was going to be thematic, that I didn't, no one wants to read a textbook that is, trying to cover all of history, with the exception of maybe saying George Washington's ghost. There's no character that is spanning 250 years of American history in a way that I could kind of make the core of the narrative. I thought, as I was writing and as I was researching, I thought about it was easier to talk about it as Washington's ghost than about like Washington's legacy, just a way of kind of making it a subject. But Washington's ghost and his will as being sort of subjects that are anchoring this book along the way. And what are the experiences that they, so to speak, are having, with different groups and in different times and places. And, eventually it just sort of, I tried to let the research guide me, and, of where I had good stories to tell, making those the centerpiece of a chapter. And thankfully I didn't have any glaring gaps, I don't think, in sort of, at least in the timeline of what I wanted to cover. There's more attention to some parts than to others, but in the end, it felt like by kind of anchoring it thematically, where each thematic chapter is focusing on sort of the next era of American history, that it would at least give people an appropriate sort of overview of how the story has changed over time.
It has struck me as you've been talking that you clearly are sort of attuned to who's reading, to who your audience is and what they will need, whether it's making sure they have all the information about Washington slavery they need to understand, or thinking about your dad and brother-in-law as readers, even saying like, no one wants to read a textbook about all of U.S. history, right? And that makes me think about your 9-to-5 job with AASLH. And I'm wondering, how do you think that your work in public history has shaped the way that you write?
Yeah, you have nailed it. I think the biggest change in how I write as a result of my public history work has been focus on audience. I think audience is not something that I thought about very much when I was writing my dissertation. I was writing it for one person, basically. I was writing it for the chair of my dissertation committee. And then the book wasn't very much different than that. It still was writing it basically for me or someone like me. And that was, if it made sense to me, it would make sense to the people who needed to make sense to, right? And then when I started working with people at museums and historic sites, and, I lead our research efforts at AASLH. And so I'm doing research on the state of the field, but I'm also in conversation with people who are in research roles at their individual museums. And so much of that is about audience evaluation of what do people want from museums? What do people want from their specific visit? What do different groups of people want? Looking at, there was some research from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, analyzed the National Survey of Public Participation in the Arts, some combination thereof, about do people who like history books also go to historic sites and watch historic TV shows? And what they found was that no, people who like TV shows watch all sorts of TV shows, and people who like doing things in person do things in person. And arriving at all of these different ways to understand audience and to really prioritize thinking about audience is something that I had just never thought about before and started thinking about and taking very seriously in the public history context. And then thinking about my book as a work of public history and not thinking about it so much as a work of scholarship is kind of where I ended up of like, okay, how do I want this book to be received and who do I want to read it? And the when was a big part of it. Like I have joked recently, I feel like I landed a plane on an aircraft carrier because I first had this idea in like 2019, 2020. And I mean, even earlier than that, early versions of this idea, but like this version of the book, I, started thinking about in 2020. And I knew it would be a good 250 book because I started working on the 250th in 2017. And I could see sort of that coming and could anticipate like, okay, I think there's going to be this moment and what a book could do in that moment might be this. And here's how I think I need to approach that book and need to write that book and what readers might want out of it at that moment. I think the same way that public historians would think about an exhibit or a public program or a podcast, thinking about who's out there and who is the audience for this and how are they going to be arriving to it and what will they come in knowing, what sort, how will they come in, what sort of preconceived notions might they have, things like that. And so maybe I would have arrived in this same place just by reading a lot, but certainly the topic itself and then also how I approached it kind of as a work of public history was all very much informed and inspired by my work with public historians around the country and my day job, serving the public history community.
You've really kind of set up my next question, which is sort of a broader question. In many ways, I guess this question is an invitation to get on your soapbox if you have one. But as someone so intimately connected to public history, what do you think about the relationship between public history and writing history books? I think about the fact that a lot of those museum goers, if they read history books, might not read history books that academic historians love them to be reading. Or I think about people who tell me they're writing for a broad audience, but then I read the book and think, I don't know what you think a broad audience is, but I don't think they'll read is writing history books a form of public history? What does that relationship look like today?
I mean, I certainly think it is, and it can be. Writing books can be a form of public history, but it's not necessarily a form of public history that you need a PhD to do. We've seen from, some of the most popular history books over the last several decades are written by journalists and others who came to history on a different path. And I think there are a lot of people who really are interested in history and meeting them where they are and recognizing that like what they are interested in is perfectly valid and can be totally justified in whatever niche topic they find exciting, even if it's not the most important debate in the field or the most cutting edge piece of scholarship or what have you. And I think there is a public service in writing for that audience, right? And not necessarily just writing something that, because you think there's this audience out there, but of being conscious and cognizant of the fact that like, oh, there are, certain types of people who are, going to be interested in this topic and what do they want, that focus on audience, how can I write it for them instead of just writing it and saying like, no, this is how to do it. This is how historians work. And if, you can't understand it this way, or you're not interested in reading it this way, then that's a you problem, not a me problem as the writer. And I think people do really enjoy history and find it fascinating and want to engage with it in all sorts of different ways. I think there are probably fewer people who want to read books than want to go to museums and historic sites. But, even within that population, I think there are certain kinds of things certain ways of writing books, certain approaches to the subject that are going to be more interesting for people than they might otherwise. And I think being really precious about how to do history and what counts as kind of capital H history is, leaving a lot on the table, and people are going to find other stuff. Like it is always a horror show when you go and look at like what the top history books on Amazon are. And, I think a lot about like, well, people are reading history books and I hope that they have more options for good ones. And so I think it is important that people are writing for that audience and kind of putting audience first in how they're approaching their book. I also think there's a lot of historians that are writing that think public historians, museum professionals are sitting around waiting for their next piece of scholarship so that they can work it into their exhibits. And among many, this is a soapbox that I have. But it's become much clearer that public history practitioners, museum practitioners don't appreciate that kind of thinking from scholars, right? That, they can't do anything until the historian finishes their scholarship, all capital letters, and then they can work it into exhibits. And it's kind of, I've seen much more than I ever would have thought now that I'm on the other side of just kind of condescension among academics toward public historians. And it turns out public historians are doing incredible work. Museum professionals are doing incredible work. They're great researchers. They're great writers. They're great storytellers. I think there is, just as much for writers of history to learn from the process and approach of museum practitioners and public history practitioners as there is for them to learn kind of content from historians.
That's a very good soapbox. I want to shift gears a little just to talk a bit more broadly about your writing. But I first want to ask, I'm always on the lookout in acknowledgments for when people are effusive about their writing group. And you were in your acknowledgement. So I'm curious, could you just tell us about your writing group? How does it work? How do you incorporate their feedback into your work?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that mostly I was just alone writing this thing, and it got to a point where I had some chapter drafts, and I was like, I need someone that I trust to read this thing. And I reached out to a colleague from grad school. Shout out to Whitney Stewart, who is now back in the public history world full time. I've brought her over, but I reached out to her because she had just published a book and worked on material culture topics and public history topics and kind of walked that line between public history and academia. And I asked her, like, if she might be willing to read something, and she mentioned to me that she had just been talking to someone else who was kind of an American studies material culture person, and they were talking about a writing group. And so everyone kind of knew one or two other people, and there ended up being kind of 5 or 6 of us that were working on various topics related to memory or public history or material culture or kind of cultural studies, something along those lines. And we ended up being a good group, and it was accountability of, we all just kind of, one person would volunteer and say, I have something I'm working on. Can we focus on my thing next month? And it was a pretty easygoing process. If someone had a deadline or someone had a revision due or whatever, they would kind of get to jump the line. But eventually I said, hey, like, I've been writing this stuff all by myself, and I really could use someone reading it. And so sent them a chapter. I think we talked pretty in depth about chapter 5 of the book about the George Washington bicentennial. And they had some really great insights. Among them, was this idea that, and this is a big part of the final chapter, that both white Americans and Black Americans during the 1932 George Washington bicentennial were expressing this desire to get back to the real, quote unquote, the real George Washington. And that, like, there was actually some really good stuff that came out of it, even from this all-white Federal Planning Commission. There were these like primary source collections and maps and published editions of Washington speeches. And there was like some genuine interest in a historical Washington, not just a mythical Washington that could teach people lessons. And they helped me kind of recognize that insight, and that totally reformulated how I approached the chapter. And then, they just had great insights to, other things I could do. This section's kind of long. This section is, you lost me here. What if it just focused on this? All those kinds of things that, for me, it was the first time I shared any of it with anyone. No one had read anything from this book except for what I put into my book proposal and, short sample that I sent to publishers. And so that was just like super worthwhile and encouraging that they were like, yeah, this is good. It's like, it all makes sense. This, like, and they just talked about it like it felt like a real book and a real project and a real chapter after those people had read it. And they were people that I really trusted and, had similar interests and interest in writing for a broader public and all of those things. And so the fact that they had genuine feedback, but also were supportive. I remember one of the members of my group was like shocked that this was a first draft of the chapter, because I genuinely didn't read it before I sent it to them. I finished writing it and was just like, here it is, like, let me have it. And they were like, no, like, this is good. This is a real thing. This is a real chapter. And that was like the kind of motivation that you need, like that'll float you for a long time when you're working alone. Of like, oh no, they said it was good. They said it was good. And so that helped. But I also, in thinking about like how to incorporate their suggestions and revisions, I always think about, I can't remember where I saw it, but the comedian Bill Hader was talking about revisions. I saw in an interview once and mentioned like, when you share writing with other people, they can always show you the things that they can tell you the things that aren't working, but the solutions are usually things that you need to come up with on your own. Sometimes it's the things that they suggest. Other times it's something that you've come up with totally originally or some combination thereof. But to me, that's the most valuable part of getting feedback on a chapter like that, or on, they eventually read the whole manuscript. But if they point out, hey, this isn't working, there's a problem here, there's almost certainly actually a problem there. It's never like, well, they just don't know what they're talking about. There's like, if they point out a problem, there's a problem in that chapter, and they may or may not have the right idea about how to fix it because they don't know what the rest of your evidence is. They don't know what things, hit the editing room floor or are in your big scraps document somewhere. But if they have pointed out a problem, it's probably a problem that needs to get solved, and you need to go back and figure out how to do it. And just having that sort of feedback was super valuable, especially early on in the process.
Are there other people that you read as inspiration for writing?
I do. I wish I could read more. It's always, reading is such a big part of writing. And yet, with my schedule being what it was, I wish I was able to do more reading while I was doing writing. But I ended up reading a bunch while I was researching, mostly audiobooks, actually, commuting back and forth to the Library of Congress, and read some great stuff that year that, I still am mostly doing nonfiction, but trying to listen to as many different forms of nonfiction, just to think about sort of what are the different ways you can tell these stories? What are the, the different structural approaches? What are the different things you could do? So like some of the books, and I think I mentioned most of these people in my acknowledgments, but like some of the books that I read while I was researching and beginning to write were like Fire Weather by John Vaillant is this incredible book. I read The Wager by David Grann. Likewise, I saw a lot of copies of that while Christmas shopping this year. I more recently read Bad Company by Megan Greenwell about private equity, but she tells the story from a really personal lens. And so just trying to explore all these different ways of doing it. I also love the essay. I love magazine essays. A good essay, I think, can teach you so much about structure and stuff like that. And they're just so enjoyable to read. I still think all the time about one essay by Amanda Mole in The Atlantic. I don't think she writes for The Atlantic anymore, but she wrote this essay about floor lamps, which sounds very silly, but the basic question was like, why are there no good floor lamps, and why do they all look basically the same? And she goes on this deep dive into like design history and, just like how big houses are and how far away things are from outlets in high-end homes, that there's not this, like this whole thing. But it's just like such a good, and it's short, but it's such a good piece of like, here's this really basic question, and here's like what a good and interesting story you can tell out of it. And I think about it all the time when I'm writing a chapter or when I'm doing something of like, okay, what's the basic question here? And is there actually a cool way, an interesting way that I can answer it? So yeah, just trying to think about people or read people who are doing cool things with structure and subject matter without getting too close to the thing I'm actually writing about.
So we are having this conversation a little over 2 months before Thy Will Be Done comes out. So I know that you will be deep in talking about this book, promoting this book for some time to come. In the back of your mind, are you looking ahead to another book, or have you decided that 4:30 a.m. is not worth it? How do you see what comes next?
Yeah, unfortunately, I have 2 ideas that I think have legs that I might be interested in writing. The way this book worked, it was just an idea that I started thinking about of like, I think there might be a book there. And I've had this with other ideas, but sometimes they just go away. Or you find the book, and you're like, oh, someone has written it. I was right. There is a book here, and here it is. But both of these ideas I've had around for a while, and so far I haven't been able to shake them, and I'll have to prioritize one over the other. But to the extent that there is ever a calling or a something beckoning you to write another book, for me it's always that of like, God, I can't stop thinking about this, and it would be so easy is usually what follows that. And then, you end up 2.5 years into the project and you're like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm doing this again. And I hate this all so much. And I never want to see George Washington's face again. He's everywhere. He's on the wallpaper of the house that we bought while I was working on this book. So he was in there judging me at breakfast every morning. But yeah, it's just, for me, it's always just some kernel of an idea that you get while reading or taking the dog for a walk or whatever. And then it just, if it sticks with you long enough and you can't help but like, yeah, I'll read this thing that like might bring me a little closer. And it's like, nope, they're not doing it, the thing that I want to do. And, and then eventually you realize, no, I think I want to actually do this. This is something that people might want to read and that I might want to write.
I have to know, did you keep the wallpaper?
Oh, it's still up there. Yes.
George Washington's ghost still.
It is. It's George Washington blowing a bubble with chewing gum. So it's only on a small piece of accent wall. So it's enough to keep up there. But it's a good conversation starter when people find out that I've written a book about Washington.
Yet one more representation of his memory.
That's right.
Dr. John Garrison Marks, thank you so much for joining me on Drafting the Past, and thanks for talking about your writing process.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This has been a blast.
Thanks again to Dr. John Garrison Marks, and thanks to you for listening. John's new book is Thy Will Be Done, George Washington's Legacy of Slavery and the Fight for American Memory. And you can find a link to it and all the other books mentioned in this episode in the show notes at draftingthepast.com. While you're there, you can also sign up for the newsletter for occasional updates and reminders of new episodes. In the meantime, I'll be here to remind you that friends don't let friends write boring history.